Hey class, so today we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is just the government using different types of tools that it has, like spending or tax cuts, to affect the economy. It's going to do this during recessions, it's going to do this during expansions, and it's just trying to bring the economy back into full employment. So first, let's take a look at what that actually means. Right here we have a graph of the ADAS model, and this is what we call the long-run equilibrium. So if you see, the long-run aggregate supply, the short-run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand all intersect in the same point, meaning that where we are, our equilibrium, is at full employment. Okay, that's that kind of perfect number between 4 and 6%, the natural rate of unemployment. So this is where the economy kind of would be on its own without a recession or without an expansion. However, we very rarely are at this point. Usually we're going to be either in a either a slight recession or sometimes a major recession or a slight expansion. And that's when the government is going to use fiscal policy, whether or not you think they should. That's when they're going to use fiscal policy, which is just spending and taxes. They're going to use fiscal policy to affect the economy. And remember, fiscal policy is made by the president and Congress. So Congress is going to write the bill that's going to either increase or decrease spending or increase or decrease taxes, and then the president's going to sign off on it. So fiscal policy, it's spending and taxes, and then the people who are in charge of it are Congress and the president. Those are some things, kind of just little bullet points that you need to remember. And then this is our graph of long-run equilibrium. So a lot of times on the AP test, the testers will ask you to show a graph starting out in long-run equilibrium, and this is what you're going to have, where you have all three lines intersecting at the same point. You've got your labels, and then the YF, this is showing that we're at full employment. So GDP, the amount of GDP we have is equal to what we would need for full employment, and then this is our equilibrium price. So let's talk about one of the types of fiscal policy that the government might use, and that's expansionary policy. Now, expansionary policy is going to be used to fight a recession. It's called expansionary because we're trying to expand the economy. We're trying to get back into an expansion. As a side note, what the economy would look like, or what the graph would look like during a recession, I've put up here. So if you notice, this is our ADAS model, and this is the economy in a recession. So if you're ever asked to draw the graph of the ADAS model in a recession, this is what you would draw. If you notice, where our equilibrium is, so where our short-run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand intersect, is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. That means that at that present moment, we're making less than we should be able to. And so it's also how much GDP we have is the exact opposite of what our employment is. So when our GDP is less than our full employment, our unemployment rate is high. So anytime this point is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply line, our unemployment is high, and on the converse, anytime it's to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve, our unemployment is really low. So right here we have economy in recession because our equilibrium is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. We call this amount right here of the difference between what our actual employment is and what full employment would be. That's called the recessionary gap. Okay, but so if we're in a recession, the government is going to use or could use two tools to get us out of that recession. They could either increase spending or they could decrease taxes. And the reason for that is they're trying to shift this aggregate demand curve to the right. They're trying to make this line shift to the right so that it brings us back into equilibrium as an economy. And so the reason those two tools would make that line shift to the right, it comes from our GDP formula. If you remember, GDP is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So if the government increases spending and government spending goes up, then GDP would increase, which would increase aggregate demand, and the line would shift to the right. Also, if the government decreased taxes, then consumers now have more money, and they're going to spend a portion of that money because of that MPC and that MPS we talked about. So if consumers get money back in their taxes, consumption spending is going to increase, so GDP would increase, so aggregate demand would increase. So either of those measures, increasing spending or decreasing taxes, is going to shift aggregate demand to the right and bring the economy back into long-run equilibrium, bring it back into full employment. And that's basically expansionary policy in a nutshell. So the second type of fiscal policy that the government can use is called contractionary policy. And the government's going to use this when we are in an expansion. Now you might be wondering, why would they try to combat an expansion? Well, the problem is if during that expansion, if inflation gets too high and it starts to hurt the economy because it's hurting people's purchasing power and it's causing interest rates to rise and the government is fearful of possibly a large crash, they might try to fight that inflation with contractionary policy. It's also known as tight money policy. Basically, we're just trying to kind of contract the economy a little bit to bring it back down to that natural rate of unemployment where we like to kind of hang out at. So the two things the government would use to fight this inflation, they would decrease spending or they would increase taxes. Now, if you look at the graph right here, this is the graph of the economy in an expansion. And if you notice, it's the exact opposite of the recession. So this equilibrium point where short run and aggregate demand intersect is to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve, meaning that for a time, now this isn't something that we could do permanently, but for a time, we're producing more than what our natural rate of unemployment says that we should be able to. So this isn't a point that we can stay at, it's just a point that we're going to hang out for a while before we move back into either a long run equilibrium or move into a recession. And it's called this difference between what we're making and our natural rate of unemployment is called the inflationary gap. So like I said, we're going to either decrease spending or increase taxes. And it's the same reason as before, that if we decrease government spending, GDP is going to decrease, so aggregate demand would decrease. And when that happens, aggregate demand would shift to the left and would bring us back into equilibrium. And it's, as you notice, it's going to decrease the price level as well. Okay, and we can also increase taxes, because if we increase taxes, consumers have less money to spend, so consumption spending is going to go down, therefore GDP and aggregate demand would go down. So that's what contractionary policy is. It's we're going to try to fight inflation by decrease aggregate demand, and remember expansionary policy is we're trying to fight that recession by increasing aggregate demand. Now there's one economic condition that it's really hard for the government to use fiscal policy to effectively combat, and that's called stagflation. Now, if you remember, stagflation is caused by a negative supply shock. So if our short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, that's going to cause both high inflation, so the price levels are going to rise, but it's also going to cause unemployment to rise or GDP to fall. Okay, sorry, I forgot one label right here. Okay, now the reason that stagflation is so hard for the government to use fiscal policy to fight is because you have the two major problems. You have both high inflation and high unemployment. If the government were going to try to decrease inflation, they would want to decrease aggregate demand. But if they do that, then unemployment is going to rise even more and GDP is going to fall even more. So that problem is going to get worse. We're going to move into a really, really bad recession. On the other hand, if the government were trying to fight the unemployment problem, if they were to increase aggregate demand, well, then the price level is just going to continue to rise. So now we might move out of a recession, our unemployment might fall, but now prices are going to be even higher. So stagflation isn't something the government can combat both at the same time. They either have to pick, are we going to fight the inflation first, or we're going to fight unemployment first, and they just have to kind of assume that they know that they're going to make the other problem worse. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is what's called non-discretionary fiscal policy. The two things that we've been talking about, contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy, those are discretionary measures, meaning the government has to decide to take those measures. Congress has to actually write up a bill, the president has to sign it, and they have a decision. They can either choose to do it or not. They could just let the economy kind of work itself out over years and years. But what's called non-discretionary fiscal policy, which are also known as automatic stabilizers, are things that happen in the economy automatically because of previous bills that Congress has written. So those could be examples of would be like unemployment benefits, taxes, and basically because tax and welfare policy has put in these automatic stabilizers, it's going to automatically affect aggregate demand. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples. Okay, so the first example I want to talk about, it happens when we're in a recession. And here we have a graph of a recession. You can see that unemployment is high because we're to the left of the long run equilibrium. So for example, when we're in a recession, there are going to be a lot of people who are looking for work who are unemployed. And those people are going to be drawing on unemployment benefits, which basically means that the government is giving them money, okay? And it's because those people are getting more money, that's going to allow them to slightly increase their consumption spending, which would shift aggregate demand somewhat, not a lot, but somewhat to the right. Okay, so even though Congress hasn't used any discretionary measures, they haven't written a bill to increase spending, and they haven't cut taxes, because those automatic stabilizers like unemployment benefits, that's going to increase aggregate demand. Another example could be more people are going to be on Medicare, so that's going to increase government spending. Food stamps, that's going to increase people's being able to purchase food. All of those different measures that automatically happen when more people are unemployed, that's going to increase aggregate demand. The other time you might have automatic stabilizers are when we're in an expansion. So if you see this graph right here, we have a very low rate of unemployment. Our GDP is high. Now, when that's happening, when we're in an expansion, people are going to be making a lot of money. They're going to be doing really well. Well, because of our tax code, because the more money you make, the higher taxes you pay, the higher rate you pay. When we're in expansion, people are going to end up paying a larger percentage of their income in taxes. So their consumption spending is going to decrease slightly, and that in itself is going to decrease aggregate demand somewhat. Even if the government takes no other measures, they don't increase spending, they don't cut taxes, that's going to cause aggregate demand to shift a little bit to the left. And that's going to be an automatic stabilizer to fight that inflation. Okay. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is time lag. Time lag basically refers to the fact that fiscal policy isn't always as effective as we'd like it to be because of the time that it takes to take these measures. So for example, if we move into recession, it's going to take some amount of time for economists to really diagnose it as a recession, that we have enough months of low GDP that they can say officially, yes, we're in a recession, it's not just a small contraction. Then Congress is going to have to spend, they're going to spend some time trying to pass a budget. So that's going to take some time, and then it's probably going to have a little bit of time lag before that budget gets implemented. And then when people get that money, it's then going to take some time for them to spend that money. So from the point that we actually enter the recession to when we actually see a change in GDP because of that fiscal policy, there might be months and months and months in between that. And if that recession was small enough that we moved out of it without any government interference being needed, then that fiscal policy might actually have the opposite effect. So for example, if we're in a recession and the government increases spending, but by the time that spending actually takes place, we've moved out of that recession, it's actually going to make inflation worse. So that's one kind of limitation to fiscal policy, is that you really have to be careful that you look at the time that it's going to take to actually implement it versus how bad is the recession in and of itself. All right, so that's all I have for y'all today. I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye, guys.